Next, we are going to configure the virtual networking within Hyper-V, the virtual switch. So we'll go to Start. We will open up our server manager, and it is in the server manager that we will access the Hyper-V management. So if we go to Tools and we go to Hyper-V Manager, this is where we're going to manage the virtual networking for Hyper-V, the guests themselves, the CPUs, how much RAM, disk, everything about the guests will be handled here. So what we'll do is we'll select this server here, the Unifor Family Practice Hyper-V 01 server, and we'll tell it that we want to go into this virtual switch management here. Okay, and so we want to create a new virtual switch, and we'll want it to be an external, so we'll click Create Virtual Switch. So we'll just call it Hyper-V External Switch. Okay, we want it to be external network, and we need to select which network card we want. Now I already know that this Broadcom 4 is the NIC port for this physical box itself, the Dell PowerEdge. So I need to assign another NIC for the virtual switch, and I have another gigabit Ethernet plugged into this first, the non-numbered, or number 1 NIC. So that one is going to be the NIC dedicated to this virtual host. Again, there are 2 Ethernet cables plugged in to the Broadcom number 4 port. That's for this physical box, the Dell PowerEdge. It's going to be hosting all of these guest server operating systems. And then this is the second cable that's plugged into this number 1 port. Okay. We want to make sure Allow Management Operating System to share this network adapter is selected. Okay. And so we're going to apply and say yes. Okay. And okay. So now you can see we have this switch. It's configured to use that network interface card, which we have a cable plugged into, and that is going to be the network card that this first host uses. So next, we're going to create the virtual machine. So what we will do is we will right-click on our server. We'll go to New Virtual Machine. Next, we're going to give it a name, and this is going to be Unifor Family Practice Domain Controller Server 01. And as you can see, that default configurations location that we put in is automatically input. We don't have to mess with that any further. We'll click Next. Generation 2, there's no reason to use Generation 1 unless you're having to do a 32-bit operating system. So we will choose Generation 2 and click Next. Startup memory. So as this is going to be a domain controller, it doesn't really need all that much RAM. I think I'll give it maybe 8 gigs for now, which would be 8,192 megabytes. And I don't like to use dynamic memory. So with dynamic memory, even if you assign it 8 gigs, it only starts with what it needs, and it dynamically on the fly allocates and pulls from the actual physical RAM what it needs, instead of grabbing it all at once and consuming it all, even if the virtual machine isn't using it. I just find that dynamic memory really reduces performance. So I do not recommend selecting that Use Dynamic Memory. Okay. Here's where we select the Hyper-V switch that we programmed. So the disk is going to be in our default location that we told it. The name is going to be, the name of the disk is going to be from what we specified earlier. And here we can tell it the size that we want. Okay. So this particular disk is 893 gigabytes in size. We don't want to use all of that. This is just a domain controller. It doesn't need all that much space. And all of this can always be modified in the future with just a few clicks of a button. So I think we'll tell it 250 gigabytes. We'll say next. And we'll tell it that we're going to install an operating system later. Next. Here we can review UFP Domain Controller Server 01, second generation, 8 gigs of RAM. It's going to use the Hyper-V switch that we told it as the network. It's going to store the disk under D Hyper-V disks, and we're telling it we'll install an operating system later. And we'll click Finish. So now, under our Hyper-V server, you can see we have a virtual machine. So now we can right-click this virtual machine and go to Settings. Here, we can change the memory. Of course, you'll want these guests to be powered off when you make these changes. We can add or remove memory. We can make it dynamic if we want. Here's where we can add processors. Right? So right now, one virtual processor is 6% of the total system resources. So we'll give it some more. We'll give it 4 virtual processors. We'll apply that. So as you can see, it's got the correct network adapter, correct disk, 4 virtual processors, 8 gigs of RAM. All that looks great. Next, we're going to get into how to install the operating system on the guest.